If you just want to kill somebody, you got to be trustworthy, make sure your appearance is okay. You can't go unshaved. They would get in the car. In the vehicle, I had some of my son's stuff in there, toys, 8-year-old toys on the dash. It was sort of like a family setting. And she wants to see my ID. I put my finger over my driver's license to hide my name. But on the opposite side was pictures. And a picture of my son.
Gary Ridgway, also known as the Green River Killer, is one of the most famous serial killers known to man. He was an American criminal who was the country's deadliest convicted serial killer. He claimed to have killed as many as 80 women, many of them being prostitutes in Washington during the 1980s and 90s, although he only pleaded guilty to 48 of those murders. As well as many other criminals, Gary Ridgway had a tough childhood, as well as a somewhat troubled home life. Born on February 18, 1949, in Salt Lake City, Utah, he was the middle son of Mary Rita Steinman and Thomas Newton Ridgway. Gary Ridgway's father was a Metro bus driver, whose route was the Pacific Highway South into Seattle. The route went through the infamous Strip, where Gary would later on find many of his victims. Relatives have said that Gary witnessed more than one violent argument between his parents. Growing up in a violent household very well might have been one of the factors contributing to why he did what he did. His mother was described as a domineering presence in the house. Friends and family that knew her also described her as someone who would wear short skirts, low-cut top, and bigger hair, something that was not normal back then. She allegedly also wore a lot of makeup, and friends and family described her as glamorous. She was a stay-at-home mom with a part-time job at JCPenney. Up until the age 13, Gary had bedwetting problems that his mother would always clean up. After each episode, she would clean his genitals in the bath. During one incident while she was washing him, her robe opened up and she was naked underneath. After the incident, he started viewing his mother in a sexual light. He even admitted to having feelings of anger and sexual attraction towards Mary. Experts stated that this was a pivotal moment regarding his psychology. Gary was a poor student with a below-average IQ of 82. He also had other learning disadvantages such as dyslexia. Growing up, Gary stayed out of trouble for the most part, until the age of 16 when he led a 6-year-old boy into the woods and stabbed him. The boy survived the attack and reported Gary walked away laughing. Allegedly, the reason he did it was to see how stabbing worked. He graduated from Thai High School in 1969 and shortly after married his 19-year-old high school girlfriend, Claudia Barrows. When Ridgway was 20 and just out of high school, he joined the Navy rather than be drafted, after marrying his steady girlfriend, Claudia Barrows, before going to Vietnam. Ridgway had an unstable sex drive and spent a lot of time with prostitutes during his military service. He contracted gonorrhea, and although it endangered him, he didn't stop having unprotected sex with prostitutes. Claudia began dating while Ridgway was in Vietnam, and in less than a year, the marriage ended. In 1973, he married his second wife, Marcia Winslow. A couple years after marriage, Gary and Marcia had a son named Matthew. During the marriage, Gary became a religious fanatic. He would read the Bible aloud, at work, at home, as well as go door to door. He would insist that Marcia follow the church pastor's strict preaching, as well as have sex outside and in inappropriate places several times a day. Their marriage was very problematic, with Gary using prostitutes throughout it, as well as Marcia getting surgery to help her with weight loss and men finally starting to find her attractive for the first time in her life. This made Gary very upset, very jealous and insecure. Marcia struggled to accept Gary's relationship with his mother, who would often control their spending and make decisions on their purchases. She also accused Marcia of not properly taking care of their son. Since Gary didn't defend her, Marcia was left feeling alone. 7 years into marriage, the couple divorced. Later on, Marcia claimed that Gary places her in a chokehold in one of their fights. Ridgway met his third wife, Judith Mawson, in 1985. Judith found Ridgway to be gentle, responsible, and structured. Unlike Marcia, Judith praised her mother-in-law for helping Ridgway handle challenging tasks for him, such as checking accounts and major purchases. Eventually, Judith took over for those responsibilities. Judith and Gary were married 14 years. When Gary Ridgway was arrested and Judith found out about how her husband was a monster, she was in complete shock. Shock and shame drove her into hiding. She stopped answering the phone, changed her name, changed her hair color and appearance completely. Her goal was to look nothing like her past.
Who turned out to be the notorious Green River Killer. A discovery both devastating.
I still can't believe it, but it has happened.
And humiliating for Judith Ridgway, the serial killer's ex-wife.
Oh, it was like a brick wall dropped in front of me. And
in July 1982, the first body had been found floating in the Green River in King County, Washington. The victim, Wendy Lee Caulfield. The young girl was strangled and tossed into the river. With sparse evidence, her murder remained unsolved. The assailant was dubbed the Green River Killer. King County police couldn't know that Caulfield would be the beginning of a killing spree lasting for years. The majority of the murders occurring from 1982 through 1984. Most of the victims were prostitutes or young runaways who worked or hitchhiked along an area of Highway 99 full of topless bars and cheap hotels. For the Green River Killer, it was a great hunting ground. Reports of women and young girls disappearing continued. Discovering skeletal remains in the woods along the river and the SeaTac airport was becoming regular. The victims ranged in age from 12 to 31. Most were left nude. Some had been sexually abused. The Green River Task Force was formed to investigate the murders, and the suspect list grew. DNA and sophisticated computer systems weren't around during the early 1980s, so the task force relied on old-fashioned police work to piece together a profile. In October 1983, Ted Bundy, who was on death row as a convicted serial killer, offered to help the task force. The lead detectives met with Bundy, who provided insight into a serial killer's mind. Ted Bundy said that the killer likely knew some of his victims and that more victims were probably buried in the areas where the victims had been found. Although the detectives found Bundy's information very interesting, it didn't help find the killer. In 1987, the task force leadership changed hands, as did the direction of the investigation. Instead of trying to prove who the serial killer was, the group worked on eliminating suspects, moving those remaining to the A list. Gary Ridgway made the original list because of two encounters he had with police. In 1980, he was accused of choking a prostitute while having sex with her in his truck near SeaTac, an area where some of the victims had been discarded. When confronted, Ridgway admitted to attempting to choke her, but said it was in self-defense because a prostitute bit him while performing oral sex. The matter was dropped. Then again, in 1982, Gary was questioned after he was caught in his truck with a prostitute. The prostitute later was identified as Kelly McGinnis, one of the victims. Ridgway was questioned again in 1983 after the boyfriend of the missing prostitute identified Ridgway's truck as the last truck his girlfriend had gone into before she vanished. In 1984, Ridgway was arrested for trying to solicit an undercover policewoman posing as a prostitute. He agreed to take a polygraph test and passed. This and his relationship with Mawson seemed to slow Ridgway's murderous rage. Although past victims continued to be discovered, fewer women were reported missing. Ridgway moved up to the A-list and was placed under surveillance. Investigators realized that he wasn't at work on many of the days that the victims reported missing. As well as the prostitutes gave the police a description of a man they've seen cruising around the area that matched Ridgway's description. Ridgway's house was searched on April 8, 1987, and was later on taken into custody. He allowed them to take a saliva and hair sample before being released. By 2001, the task force had younger detectives familiar with computers and knowledgeable about DNA research. DNA evidence played the largest role in the capturing of the Green River Killer. On November 30, 2001, Ridgway was arrested for the 20-year-old murders of Marcia Chapman, Opal Mills, Cynthia Hines, and Carol Ann Christensen. The evidence was DNA matches from each victim to Gary Ridgway. Also, paint samples matched with the paint used where Ridgway worked. In a plea bargain to avoid death row, Ridgway agreed to cooperate with the investigation into the remaining Green River murders. For months, Ridgway disclosed details of each murder he had committed. He took investigators to locations where he had left bodies and disclosed how he killed each one. Ridgway said his preferred method of murder was strangulation. He started with a chokehold and then later used a ruler to twist fabric around the victims' necks. Sometimes he killed them inside his house and other times in the woods. On November 2, 2003, Gary Ridgway pleaded guilty to the 48 charges of aggravated first-degree murder. He also confessed to having sex with 6 of the bodies after he had killed them, and now moving the body parts to Oregon to throw off the investigation. In 2003, accepted a plea deal in which he would be sentenced to 48 consecutive life sentences without parole.